We discuss the catastrophe of World War I. Today, we are moving into the aftermath, a decade that felt like a party that would never end. We call it the Roaring Twenties. As you can see from this title slide, it was an era defined by a false sense of security. We're going to explore how a decade of wealth and excess crumbled into the greatest economic disaster in history, setting the stage for a second, even deadlier war. While Europe was licking its wounds, America was booming. This was the birth of modern consumer culture. For the first time, things like radios, motor cars, and cinema were transforming daily life for average people. Culturally, it was the Jazz Age. We saw the rise of flappers, young women who challenged traditional social norms with new fashions and attitudes. To the average American, it seemed like the good times were here to stay, even while Europe struggled to rebuild. People were so terrified of another war that they tried to ban it, literally. In 1928, nations signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, promising to never use war to solve disputes. It sounds nice, right? But it was like a no bullying sign in a school hallway with no teachers around to enforce it. It showed how much the world wanted peace, but it didn't actually provide a way to keep it. Despite these tensions, there was a desperate hope for peace. This culminated in 1928 with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was an international agreement signed by over 60 nations to essentially outlaw war. It sounds noble, and it symbolized the world's desire for lasting peace. However, it had a fatal flaw. It lacked any enforcement mechanisms. It was a promise on paper with no army to back it up. Back in the US, the Roaring Twenties were about to hit a wall. There were serious warning signs that people ignored. First, there was a growing wealth gap. Easy credit led to overproduction. Factories and farms were producing more than people could afford to buy. Second, there was rampant speculation in the stock market. People were buying on margin, which meant borrowing money to buy stocks. They were gambling with money they didn't actually have. The bubble finally burst in October 1929. We call it Black Tuesday. Panic selling took over, and stock prices plummeted. Billions of dollars in wealth vanished overnight. Banks that had invested their depositors' money in the stock market failed immediately. The party was officially over. The crash didn't just hurt investors, it destroyed the banking system. We saw bank runs where terrified customers rushed to withdraw their money, causing thousands of institutions to close permanently. Crucially, at this time, no deposit insurance existed. If your bank closed, your life savings were simply lost forever. This erased the financial security of millions of ordinary families. Because the global economy was connected, this American crisis quickly became a global catastrophe. Desperate U.S. bankers demanded repayment of loans from Europe. This caused economies to collapse across Germany and Austria. To make matters worse, nations tried to protect their own industries with tariffs, which caused global trade to plummet by 65%. The Great Depression had gone worldwide. In the United States, the impact was devastating. By 1933, unemployment reached 25%. 1 in 4 workers had no job. Breadlines and soup kitchens became a common sight in every major city. Homelessness skyrocketed, leading to the creation of shantytowns on the edges of cities. People called them Hoovervilles, named sarcastically after President Herbert Hoover, whom they blamed for the crisis. As if the economic depression wasn't enough, an environmental disaster struck the American Midwest, the Dust Bowl. Caused by severe drought and years of over-tilling the land, massive dust storms swept across the Great Plains. These storms buried entire towns and destroyed farms. It forced a massive migration of farmers, often called Okies, to flee toward California in search of work. Amidst this misery, people looked for escape. The 1930s saw a boom in cultural escapism. Cinema and radio became vital, providing cheap relief for struggling families who wanted to forget their troubles for a few hours. At the same time, literature reflected the reality of the times. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath famously depicted the hardships of the era. Political systems were tested to their breaking points. In democratic nations like Britain and France, governments struggled to find solutions. They attempted to fix the economy through high taxes and protective tariffs, while their multi-party coalitions often struggled to take decisive action. Importantly, their democratic systems survived the crisis. Other nations would not be so lucky. In Italy, the economic chaos fed extremism. Benito Mussolini rose to power by exploiting the people's fear of communism and the economic distorter. He promised order. His paramilitary troops, the Black Shirts, used violence to silence any opposition. Mussolini established a system where the state controlled the economy and daily life, creating the model for fascism. In Germany, the situation was even more fragile. The Weimar Republic was a weak democratic government, already hated by many for signing the Treaty of Versailles. They had suffered through hyperinflation in 1923 that destroyed middle-class savings. When the Great Depression hit, it delivered the final blow. The German people were desperate for a savior. That desperation opened the door for Adolf Hitler. The Nazi Party promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore German pride. Hitler scapegoated Jews and communists for Germany's problems. It is important to note that he was appointed chancellor legally in 1933. Shortly after, the Enabling Act was passed, granting him dictatorial powers and ending German democracy. To the east, the Soviet Union was following a different but equally brutal path under Joseph Stalin. Because they were a communist state, they were isolated from the capitalist stock market crash. Stalin implemented 5-year plans to drive rapid industrialization. However, this came at a horrific cost. He forced the collectivization of agriculture and launched the Great Purge to eliminate political enemies. In Asia, the Depression devastated Japan's export economy, especially the silk industry. As the economy crumbled, military leaders seized control of the government. Seeking resources to survive, they turned to conquest. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. This act of aggression showed the world that the League of Nations was powerless to stop war. Back in the U.S., a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, took a different approach. He introduced the New Deal. His strategy was based on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. The government created massive job programs to put people back to work. He also signed the Social Security Act, establishing a safety net for the elderly and disabled. The New Deal was revolutionary, but it wasn't a magic cure. It did not completely end the Depression. However, it restored the public's faith in the banking system and the government. Most importantly, it shifted the American political philosophy. For the first time, the government was seen as responsible for the welfare of its citizens. As the 1930s came to a close, the world was on the brink again. The economic desperation of the Great Depression had fueled radicalism. While the democracies were too weak and focused on their own economies to stop aggression, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, had formed. The false sense of security of the 1920s was long gone. The stage was now set for the Second World War.